It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Daniel Anlezark. Daniel is the McCaughey Professor of Early English Language and Literature in the Department of English here at the University of Sydney. He's published widely on medieval literature and its manuscripts, and among his interests is the history of medieval prayer and piety. Dan's talk today is entitled More Than Just Its Prayers, a late medieval Dutch prayer book in the Fisher Library. It focuses on this late 15th century manuscript, and it will provide a brief overview of the book in its evolving historical contexts, from the time of its manufacture until it was acquired by the library. Please join me in welcoming Dan.
So good afternoon, everybody. The subject of my little talk today is a little prayer book, an unstudied book, which has the shelf mark Fisher Library Additional Manuscript 342. That's its name now. The manuscript is a 15th century book for private prayer in Latin and Middle Dutch, and contains many of the kinds of devotional prayers we would expect in the late 15th century, and especially in the Low Countries. There's an emphasis throughout on devotion to the suffering Christ. There are prayers to the cross, to the wounds of Christ, to the instruments of the Passion, the so-called Arma Christi, and so on. These are found beside another strong emphasis on prayers to the Virgin Mary. With this, there are also sets of prayers associated with two sacraments in particular, Holy Communion and Confession. The book has been slightly battered by time, and in the first decade of the 19th century, a small group of children wrote their names in its margins, some with the claim that they had learned this book, dit Buch gelernt. We'll look at these soon. In my talk today, I'd like to introduce you to this little book, which measures about 10 by 15 centimetres, fit into a medieval pocket quite comfortably, and peel back some of its layers and accretions and try to understand something of the context of its production and early ownership. This slide is where the book is open now, the first page, and there's no reason to think other than that it always was the first page of the book. We can see repairs to the top left and bottom right corners. As we look at some of the pages of this book, you'll see the work of two scribes, maybe three, I'm only convinced of two so far, writing in the same late 15th century script with their own slight personal variations. They generally take over from each other on new pages, but the evidence of the quires and bindings show that they were working together, and I believe that they were professional scribes making this book to order. They're writing on paper rather than parchment, which is only slightly unusual in a late 15th century Northern European manuscript. The book was written out in an area where the technology of print was already firmly entrenched by the late 15th century, and the use of paper as a medium is probably associated with its ready availability in the scribal workshop and its relative lower cost at the time than vellum. The pages of the book are numbered in two ways by much later hands than those of the scribes, and I'm going to look at some images of the page numbering later. The numbering of the pages, as you can see from the first number here on page 1, at the top there at the right, varies a little in practice. The page numbers are written in the top right corner of the recto page and the top left corner of the verso. It's just how we still number pages in books. Pages 1 to 31 are numbered in ink. The reverse of this leaf is page 2, and so on. Page 32 is numbered in pencil, and then the ink comes back for page 33, suggesting perhaps that the paginator forgot to write 32. Page 34, though, is then numbered in pencil in a different hand, and pages 35, or 34 onwards, to 354, the last page, are numbered in pencil by a different hand from these ink numbers. As I say, we'll look at the page numbering soon because there's a serious and a very interesting problem with it. This problem is corrected by a later hand, as we'll see, who's written, a modern hand, written folio numbers in the bottom right corner of each verso, so the facing page of each of the folio leaves. Note that this system, the numbering of folios, numbers each leaf, not each page, so that folio 1, recto and verso, front and back, are pages 1 and 2. So this is folio 1, recto, that we're looking at here. The numbering is gone from the bottom because of damage to the page. As I've mentioned, the manuscript appears to be complete at the front. It is, however, missing leaves of an unknown number at the end. It finishes incomplete in the middle of a sentence. At the front, we still have the fly leaves from the original binding, which we'll look at later. This includes leaves cut from a 13th or 14th century manuscript and one single paper leaf, which you can see on this slide. You can see here a pattern of overwriting with our 19th century children writing over perhaps two earlier hands, the lower of which is a non-professional script writing in Dutch of about 1500. I haven't got up to transcribing or trying to transcribe or even, let alone translate this. Peter Spee's name, as you can see at the top there, is prominent, and the date with it of 1807. One child whose name appears 3 times across the manuscript is a girl who signs herself as Maria Elisabeth Geertz, and like Peter, she also claims to have learned this book. She claims it in Dutch. She's doing that here in not very good handwriting. I doubt her claim and his. In her case, we might wonder not only at the ability to read heavily abbreviated Latin, though perhaps with instruction the Middle Dutch might have been more comprehensible, though the ability of the children whose handwriting, as I say, is a bit dodgy, to read this script, this medieval script, should be doubted. Some evidence and ground for this doubt is found in another of Maria Elisabeth's inscriptions, where she has written upside down in the lower margin, once again that she's learnt this book. I'd like to return again to the problem of pagination, which I've already mentioned. You can see on this slide an opening in the book which might make clear my earlier comments about the way the pagination and the foliation work together. You can see the foliation at the bottom right. Here we're looking at folio 18 and the back of folio 17. You can also see the top of this page, the penciled number 37. The facing page is numbered, somewhat surprisingly, number 34. This might naturally lead to the conclusion that a leaf is missing here, not an unusual occurrence in the course of time with such books. However, when we go just a page further in the book, we find this image. Here is page 36, followed by page 37. So, additional manuscript 342 has 2 page 37s, and indeed 2 page 38s as well. But it has only one folio 18. This slide shows you the problematic sequence. So, what does all this mean? It's evident in a way that I can't show on the slide that folio 18 has been pasted in. There it is again. You can see a bit of the problem with the alignment. Yeah. Who would do such a thing, and why would they do it? The answer to this question points to the aspects of the later ownership of the book. I hypothesize the following sequence of events. Sometime in the early 19th century, right at the beginning of it, the first decade, let's say, the book was in private hands and not highly valued, as the scribbles of the school children in its margins suggest, with their great boasts about reading medieval Latin texts. The book then passed into the hands of a bookseller who had a better sense, or perhaps should we say a different sense, of its value. The bookseller quickly wrote in page numbers in pencil, extending and completing the numbering of the pages to the end of the book. When it came time to sell the book, or when the chance came to sell the book, this bookseller, perhaps at the prompting of a prospective buyer, mistakenly discovered that pages 37 and 38 were missing. If we go back to that slide, note that the numbers 7 and 9 in this hand look dangerously similar. So it's caused some confusion, I think. The bookseller then stuck in a leaf and numbered these pages of that replacement leaf, 37 and 38, to make up the perceived lack. This is not pure hypothesis. You'll notice here that while the writing is slightly out of alignment, the text doesn't continue. You'll have to trust me on that. But surprisingly, in fact astoundingly, the scribal hand looks, I think, exactly the same. It's certainly the same as a hand that appears later in the book, if there are 3 scribal hands. The chance that a stray leaf from a 15th century manuscript in the same hand as is already found in the, a same hand that's already found in the manuscript would be available to a 19th century bookseller is most improbable unless that bookseller had in his, maybe her hand, a book in not great condition, complete at the front but damaged at the back. And I suspect strongly that the damage at the back when this book was purchased or obtained by the bookseller had a few loose leaves associated with the damage at the back. Detached, maybe fully detached. And one of these leaves, I would suggest, has been stuck in as the extra pages 37 and 38. A later modern owner, 19th or early 20th century, has realised the duplication and attempted to correct, or has corrected the sense of pagination with the introduction of folios, numbering consecutively from one to the end, so that we have a proper sequence of pages rather than a repetition of numbers as the pages offer. These shenanigans offer us an insight into the 19th century ownership of the book. But what about its original owner? This was obviously a pious person of the late Middle Ages with a taste for devotion to the cross, devotion to the Virgin Mary, and who practiced the reception of the sacraments, confession and Holy Communion. There are lots of prayers around these too. The owner was undoubtedly lay rather than a professional religious, for whom such a book would have been far too elementary. It's not even a book of hours, this one. It doesn't follow the cycle of prayer through the week, let alone the year. So we have a lay owner. The devotions it contains, as I've said, are typical of the time. We also have a devotion to the name of Jesus, which is a good late 15th, early 16th century popular devotion to mark the piety in it. The prayers are usually rubricated, though not always. You can see some rubrication here. And both in Latin and in Dutch, we're told sometimes this is a really good prayer. Not a prayer for anything, it's just a really good prayer in the abstract. Others are labelled simply a prayer after confession or a prayer after the reception, meaning the reception of Holy Communion, and so on. So on this page we see, you've got that rubric down the bottom on the left there. De precor de domina nostra valde utilis. It's a bit ungrammatical in Latin, but you see at the top of the next page, de precor te domina mea sancta Maria perpetua virginum, and so on. This has the feature, it looks to me a bit like catchwords, and you can see by the gap between the two pages that what follows is probably bound in as a separate booklet. But if it's catchwords telling the binder that these words are following, bind them here, which is a fairly familiar practice, a very universal practice in the Middle Ages, something's also gone wrong and it's turned into a bit of a rubric. And the te has become a de in these catchwords, de precor, de domina nostra. But it tells us that it's valde utilis, really, really useful, this prayer. Or to be used a lot. It could be understood either way. So these prayers on the right introduce a real strong Marian section to the prayer book, whose prayers to the Lady Mary, as she's called here. These prayers here particularly are introductions to devotion which remained popular in Catholic piety well into the modern period, including the 19th century, the Little Office of Our Lady. This set of Marian prayers in its leaves have been bound to the preceding section, as these catchwords seem to indicate. The same scribe, though, is still at work, and this binding reveals to us, I think, more of the customization of the devotional book for the requirements of the person who ordered it to be made. This is a pretty little page. It's got lots of crosses on it, which presumably indicates that the prayer is supposed to make the sign of the cross as they're praying. There are some clear and, on this page also, unequivocal clues about the gender of the person who had this book made, if not her name, because she's a she, without a doubt. Prayer books don't contain narratives, they speak in the first person of the person who's praying them. Latin is a highly gendered language, so that when the prayer speaks of themselves, the endings of their words tell us their gender. In this book we find, without a doubt, a woman at prayer. on this slide with all these prayers, which are almost have the quality of a charm the way they're used. She refers to herself as me ancilam suam, to me your servant, but the endings tell us your female servant, though ancilla probably would do that anyway. Earlier on page 53, a very lovely statement of herself, the ego famula tua, I your servant, I your female servant, she prays here in a prayer to Our Lady, Oratio de Domina. This discovery of a medieval woman's prayer book in Fisher Library is exciting in itself, but it also provides some evidence about this woman and her education. The book is a working prayer book. That is, it is not a pretty object with pictures, simply potentially a show of wealth. Not only can this woman read, she can read Latin. The Latin in the book is so heavily abbreviated that her knowledge of the language must have been more than the passive kind that recited familiar Latin prayers. And some of these prayers actually are not that familiar. It's hard to work out where they've come from. To read abbreviated Latin, you would need to know Latin. How literate was she? Good question. Could she write? The late 15th century overwritten 15th century hand overwritten by Peter Spey, or Petrus Spey as he variously calls himself, and his friends, becomes very interesting in this light. The same hand is found between the lines of the Gothic hand of the flyleaves, writing in all of the available space. This is the next part of my research, and I can't tell you today, but there is evidence here of our female owners' literacy, I suspect. So, as I looked at this, I was trying to reflect on why somebody would want a manuscript made in an age and in an area where print was available. And it's I was discussing this with my wife last night, who was very interested in the gender politics of it and the history of printing that it implies. The early printing is normally done by subscription. You don't print a book until you've got a large number of people who are going to make it profitable for you to print the book. Most of those people will, of course, be men because they have money and they have literacy and they can participate in such things as subscribing for books. But with the advent of printing, and therefore the economics and to a certain extent the gender politics of printing, the bespoke nature of the woman's prayer book disappears. Women in printed prayer books have to assume a male persona. They become famulus tuus rather than famula tua. So there are various things. There's the bespoke nature, so I can have this book and I can have in it exactly what I want because the scribes will put in it what I ask them. But there's also that my voice can be inscribed into the text. Within a century this is gone because it becomes far too expensive for normal people. She's obviously at the wealthy end of normal to be able to buy a book, to have books made for them in this bespoke way. I'll finish there because that's pretty close to my 20 minutes and happily take observations, questions and discussions about this little prayer book. Thank you.
Thank you. So you're pretty sure it is bespoke and it's a one-off. I'm just wondering, do the portions of the two scribes tend to fit the choirs or something like that? Is there a possibility of workshop production of multiple copies or something like that? Or even of parts of it, some of the choirs?
I suspect that the front section, the bit up to where the Little Office of the Virgin kicks in, is far more bespoke than what follows. Mm-hmm. I don't know how these things work. Perhaps they had a catalogue of prayers, but the Little Office of the Virgin would have been, and its accompanying prayers would have been so popular that I suspect that could be stuck on the back. So it's probably more, in my estimation, more bespoke at the beginning than at the end. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. No, I was trying to imagine what would happen in the workshop or whatever, but that makes sense.
Because we have the same hands working, so I mean, the people who are making these books are certainly feeling the pressure too in the late 15th century from printing, which is cutting costs in all sorts of ways that modern vice-chancellors would enjoy. Yeah.
And just connected with that, is the style of decoration the same throughout in all the portions?
Well, it's a very interesting question. The only two decorated initials are the one at the front and the one that begins the Little Office of the Virgin.
I see.
So again, pointing very much to, I think, that this is bespoke at the beginning, but that's sort of ready to stick on at the end. for people who want it. So it's still bespoke in its as a sammelband, as something that's brought together. But yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Jane?
Thanks, Dan. Are there any indications about place beyond the fact that it's Dutch?
It's a really interesting question, and maybe digging into this handwriting underneath will give something, if hopefully there's a name there. But the names of the children I did some research on, they're most likely the Eastern Netherlands, sort of almost all to the German border.
Yeah, but they're later, aren't they?
They're later, that's all, yeah. So the thing is that this is not I think this is a book that never made it into an institution.
Could it have stayed in a family?
It could have stayed in a family, yes. But the children's surnames are different, but that doesn't mean they're not related. Two of them certainly are. Marie Elizabeth's brother, William, also writes in the margins, yeah. But it could have made its way sort of to the parish church, and the parish priest is in fact instructing the children in their prayers from it. Though I don't think he would have let them write their names in it. So again, I think it's pointing to a domestic environment that this is still being owned. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Whether or not it's continuous and that those names indicate the original provenance is a different matter. Yeah. Yeah.
And does that mean it remained in Catholic hands from the beginning?
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? We're in a part of the world that's quite Protestant. I don't know. But if they're saying that they learnt the book, yeah, there are Catholics, plenty of Catholics in the Protestant part of the Netherlands who become, most of them, the old Catholics in the 1870s. They go there because they don't like living in the Spanish Netherlands, and they prefer a freer form of Catholicism, and the Dutch Calvinists actually let them use their old cathedrals because it annoys the Spanish emperor and that sort of thing. But then they become a part of the community. So they're Calvinists, and Jansen was one of these, sort of, with this strong association with Calvinism in the Protestant part of the Netherlands. So I wouldn't go so far as to try and speculate that that's the sort of people we're dealing with, but it's possible. But so there is Catholicism in a very predominantly Protestant Calvinist society, which is tolerated. And then, as I say, in the 1870s, with the proclamation of papal infallibility, decide they'll go their own way and become the old Catholics. So yes, I don't know, but it's very interesting that it's the first decade of the 19th century. Because I was trying to work out, so Napoleon doesn't invade the Netherlands till a little bit later, because if you had and he breaks up the monastic library collections. That's when you start to see things disperse. But this is before that. They're dating this before that, which I think is significant. So again, pointing away from institutional ownership. Yeah. If they dated themselves 1815, 1820, then you'd have no idea where it had been at all. Yep. Does that deal with that? Yeah. So I don't. But it's a very interesting religious environment that it comes from then till now as well. Yeah.
Sorry, you may have already said this, but is it a personal devotional, or is there some of the content that's they could have heard in services? There are some liturgical prayers in it, but they're things that have been excerpted from the Mass. So there is a sequence of prayers in it that follows the major feast days. So you get the Sundays of Lent, you get Easter, and then you get a few other high feasts. But it's not directly and closely associated with the liturgy. So my understanding of it would be that this person has some of the prayers from those important masses for those days and uses them for personal devotion for weeks at a time, reflecting on the thought of the season, sort of, if that makes sense. But it is very much a personal prayer book in that way. You might take it to church with you so that you could say your prayers after communion, of which there are many in Dutch and Latin. But you wouldn't be following the Mass with this book. Yeah. It's not sort of like later printed missals with facing page sort of Latin and Dutch or Latin and English so that you can follow the service. It's not that. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Join me again in thanking Dan.